Section 18 of Great Events in the History of North and South America. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Rita Boutros. Great Events in the History of North and South America by Charles Goodrich. Chapter 9. Queen Anne's War. King William having deceased in 1702, Queen Anne was seated on the British throne, and war soon began again to rage throughout Europe. England and France, including Spain also, drew the sword to settle some unadjusted claims between them, and the contest of the parent countries, as usual, soon involved their American colonies. The states of Massachusetts and New Hampshire became the principal scenes of the war in America, the colony of New York being secured from aggression through the neutrality of the 5 nations on her borders. The war, which lasted more than 10 years, is generally denominated Queen Anne's War, and was attended with the usual barbarous and distressing results incident to savage warfare. The drama opened at Deerfield on the Connecticut River on the 19th of February, 1704. The preliminaries to it had occurred a little before, in the destruction of several small settlements from Casco to Wells in Maine, and the killing and capture of 130 people in the aggregate. This was in contravention to the solemn assurance given by the Eastern Indians of peace with New England. As Deerfield was a frontier town, the enemy had watched it for the purpose of capture from an early period. Indeed, it had been constantly exposed to inroads during King William's War, but had resolutely maintained its ground, and increased in size and population, especially from the termination of that war. It was palisaded, though imperfectly. Several detached houses were protected by slight fortifications, and 20 soldiers had been placed within it. They had, however, been quartered about in different houses, and forgetting their duty as soldiers, were surprised with the rest of the inhabitants. There was a great depth of snow upon the ground, a circumstance which gave the enemy an easy entrance over the pickets. The commander of the French was Hertel de Rouville. The assailants, in approaching the place, used every precaution to avoid disturbing the soldiery or the inhabitants by noise in walking over the crusted snow, stopping occasionally, that the sound of their feet might appear like the fitful gusts of the wind. But the precaution was unnecessary, for the guard within the fort had retired and fallen asleep. None of all who were in the village awaked, except to be put immediately into the sleep of death, to be doomed to a horrible captivity, or to effect a difficult and hazardous escape into the adjacent woods amidst the snows of winter. The houses were assaulted by parties detached in different directions. The doors were broken open, the astonished people dragged from their beds, and pillage and personal violence in all its forms ensued. They who attempted resistance were felled by the tomahawk or musket. Some of the separate features of this work of destruction and scene of agony deserve particular notice, and will ever call up the painful sympathies of the reader of history. The minister of the place, the Reverend John Williams, who subsequently wrote a narrative of the affair and of his own captivity, was a conspicuous actor and sufferer in the sad tragedy. Early in the assault, which was not long before the break of day, about 20 Indians attacked his house. Instantly leaping from his bed, he ran towards the door, and perceived a party making their entrance into the house. He called to awaken 2 soldiers who were sleeping in the chamber, and had only returned to the bedside for his arms when the enemy rushed into the room. Upon this, as he says, I reached my hands up to the bed tester for my pistol, uttering a short petition to God, expecting a present passage through the valley of the shadow of death. He leveled it at the breast of the foremost Indian, but it missed fire. He was immediately seized by 3 Indians, who secured his pistol and, binding him fast, kept him naked in the cold nearly the space of an hour. One of these captors was a leader or captain, who soon met the fate he merited. Says Mr. Williams, "The judgment of God did not long slumber, for by sunrising he received a mortal shot from my next neighbor's house." This house was not a garrison, but being defended by 7 resolute men and as many resolute women, withstood the efforts of 300 French and Indians. They attacked it repeatedly, and tried various methods to set it on fire, but without success, in the meanwhile suffering from the fire which was poured upon them from the windows and loopholes of the building. The enemy gave up the attempt in despair. Mrs. Williams, having been confined but a few weeks previously, was feeble, a circumstance which rendered her case hopeless, but her agony was intensely increased by witnessing the murder of 2 of her little ones, who were dragged to the door and butchered, as was also a black woman belonging to the family. Rifling the house with the utmost rudeness, the enemy seized Mrs. Williams, ill as she was, and 5 remaining children, with a view to carry them into captivity. While these transactions were in progress, a lodger in the house, Captain Stoddard, seized his cloak and leaped from a chamber window. He escaped across Deerfield River, and finding it necessary to secure his feet from injury, he tore the cloak into pieces and wrapped them up in it, and was thus enabled, though in great exhaustion, to reach Hatfield. An assault was made upon the house of Captain John Sheldon, but the door was so strong and so firmly bolted that the enemy found it difficult to break or penetrate it. Their only resort, therefore, was to perforate it with their tomahawks. Through the aperture thus made they thrust a musket, fired, and killed Mrs. Sheldon, a ball striking her as she was rising from her bed in an adjoining room. The mark of the ball was long to be seen in a timber near the bed, the house having been carefully preserved, bearing upon the front door the marks of the Indian hatchet. In the meantime the son and son's wife of Captain Sheldon sprang from a chamber window at the east end of the building, but unfortunately for the lady her ankle became sprained by the fall, and being unable to walk she was seized by the Indians. The husband escaped into the adjoining forest and reached Hatfield. The enemy at length gaining possession of the house, reserved it, on account of its size, as a depot for the prisoners taken in the village. At the expiration of about 2 hours, the enemy having collected the prisoners, and plundered and set fire to the buildings, took up their march from the place. 47 persons had been put to death, including those killed in making the defense. "We were carried over the river to the foot of the mountain about a mile from my house," says Mr. Williams, "where we found a great number of our Christian neighbors, men, women, and children, to the number of 100, 19 of whom were afterwards murdered in the way, and 2 starved to death near Coos, in a time of great scarcity and famine the savages underwent there. When we came to the foot of the mountain, they took away our shoes, and gave us Indian shoes to prepare us for our journey." At this spot a portion of the enemy was overtaken by a party of the English, consisting of the few who had escaped, together with the men who had defended the 2 houses, and a small number from Hatfield, and a brisk fight ensued. The little band, however, was in danger of being surrounded by the main body of the enemy's troops as they came into the action, and accordingly they were compelled to retreat. They left 9 of their number slain. The attack on the enemy, under such circumstances, indicated the resolute and sympathizing spirit of the people, but it had well nigh proved fatal to the prisoners. Rouville, fearing at one time a defeat, had ordered the latter to be put to death, but providentially the bearer of the message was killed before he executed his orders. They were, nevertheless, held in readiness to be sacrificed in the event of disasters happening to the enemy. Soon after the termination of the skirmish, Rouville commenced his march for Canada. 300 miles of a trackless wilderness were to be traversed, and that, too, at a very inclement season of the year. The prospects of the captives were gloomy beyond description. Many were women, at that time under circumstances requiring the most tender treatment. Some were young children, not sufficiently strong to endure the fatigues of traveling. Infants there were, who must be carried in their parents' arms, or left behind to be butchered by the savage, or frozen on the snow, and of the adult males, several were suffering from severe wounds. The first day's journey was but 4 miles, and was signalized by the murder of an infant. The Indians, however, seemed disposed generally to favor the captives, by carrying on their backs such children as were incapable of traveling. From mercenary motives, they wished to keep all alive that they could, as the captives would bring a price, or be serviceable to them in some way in Canada. It was no sentiment of compassion that moved them, for as soon as their patience failed them, the miserable captive, whether man, woman, or child, was knocked on the head. At night they encamped in a meadow in what is now Greenfield, where they cleared away the snow, spread boughs of trees, and made slight cabins of brush for the accommodation of the prisoners. The strongest of the latter were bound after the Indian manner that night, and every subsequent night, in order to prevent escape. In the very first night one man broke away and escaped, and at the same time Mr. Williams, who was considered the principal of the captives, was informed by the commander-in-chief that if any more attempted to escape, the rest should be put to death. In the second day's march occurred the death of Mrs. Williams. In the course of the route it became necessary to cross Creek River, at the upper part of Deerfield Meadow. From some change of conductors, Mr. Williams, who had before been forbidden to speak to his fellow captives, was now permitted to do it, and even to assist his distressed wife, who had begun to be exhausted. But it was their last meeting, and most affecting was the scene. She very calmly told him that her strength was fast failing, and that he would soon lose her. At the same time she did not utter the language of discouragement or of complaint, in view of the hardness of her fortune. When the company halted, Mr. Williams, former conductor, resumed his place, and ordered him into the front, and his wife was obliged to travel unaided. They had now arrived at the margin of Green River. This they passed by wading through the water, which was about 2 feet in depth, and running with great rapidity. They now came to a steep mountain, which it was necessary to ascend. The narrative of Mr. Williams says here: "No sooner had I overcome the difficulty of that ascent, but I was permitted to sit down, and to be unburdened of my pack. I sat pitying those who were behind, and entreated my master to let me go down and help my wife, but he refused. I asked each of the prisoners as they passed by me after her, and heard that passing through the above said river she fell down, and was plunged all over in the water, after which she traveled not far, for at the foot of the mountain the cruel and bloodthirsty savage who took her slew her with his hatchet at one stroke. The same day a young woman and child were killed and scalped. After some days they reached the mouth of White River, where Rouville divided his force into several parties, who took different routes to the St. Lawrence. Mr. Williams belonged to a party which reached the Indian village St. Francis on the St. Lawrence by the way of Lake Champlain. After a short residence at that village, he was sent to Montreal, where he was treated with kindness by the governor, Vaudreuil. In the year 1706, 57 of these captives were conveyed to Boston in a flagship, among whom were Mr. Williams and all his remaining children, 2 having been ransomed and sent home before, except his daughter Eunice, whom, notwithstanding all his exertions, he was never able to redeem, and whom, at the tender age of 10 years, he was obliged to leave among the Indians. As she grew up under Indian influence, having no other home, and no other friends who could counsel and guide her, she adopted the manners and customs of the Indians, settled with them in a domestic state, and by her husband had several children. She became also, it is said, a Catholic, and ever afterwards firmly attached to that religion. This perhaps is scarcely a matter of surprise, as the sentiment was the more easily instilled into her mind from her age and the circumstances in which she was placed. Some time after the war she visited her relations at Deerfield in company with her husband. She was habited in the Indian costume, and strange as it may seem, though every persuasive was used to induce her to abandon the savages and to remain among her connections, all was in vain. She continued to lead the life of a savage, and though she repeated her visits to her friends in New England, she uniformly persisted in wearing her blanket and counting her beads. 2 of the children of Mr. Williams, after their return, became worthy and respectable ministers, one at Waltham, the other at Long Meadow, in Springfield. The captive Mr. Williams, upon his return to the colony, was desired by the remnant of his Deerfield friends to resume the duties of his pastoral office in that place. He complied with their request, and having remarried, reared another family of children, and died in 1729. During Queen Anne's War, no other single tragedy occurred like that of Deerfield. But at all times the enemy were prowling about the frontier settlements, watching in concealment for an opportunity to strike a sudden blow, and having done irreparable mischief, to escape with safety. The women and children retired into garrisons. The men left their fields uncultivated, or labored with arms at their sides, and having sentinels posted at every point whence an attack could be apprehended. Yet, notwithstanding these precautions, the Indians were often successful, killing sometimes an individual, sometimes a whole family, sometimes a band of laborers, 10 or 12 in number, and so alert were they in their movements that but few of them fell into the hands of the whites. Queen Anne died in 1714, and George I of the House of Brunswick ascended the throne of England. During the reign of the latter, a state of warfare existed between the enemy and the colony of Massachusetts and New Hampshire for several years, distressing to the former, but attended by few signal conflicts, disasters, or victories. At length, however, it was discovered that the Indians, although instigated still by the French, were not averse to peace. Accordingly, towards the latter part of the year 1725, a treaty was concluded at Boston, and the next spring was ratified at Falmouth. A period of tranquillity succeeded this event in the northern colonies. End of section 18.